Let's talk about how the Taliban manipulated Afghanistan's elections using game theory and explosives. Just some quick background. Afghanistan had elections throughout the 20th century, but those elections stopped during the 1990s. During that time, the Taliban was taking over the country. After the US began its military occupation of Afghanistan in 2001, the first elections were held in 2004. The winner was Hamid Karzai, a member of the Pashtun tribe. That tribe is not only the largest tribe in Afghanistan, it is the tribe where most of the Taliban come from, which is an important detail for later on in this video. Afghanistan subsequently held successful elections in 2005, 2009, 2010, and 2014. In fact, the days of each election are exactly the days we see large spikes in this chart. What is this data and why does it see large jumps on election days? This data connects to the Taliban, but first let's imagine the Taliban's position. Say you're a member and you're looking at the future. You've lost power and this new government is taking control. What is your main goal going forward? You might want to seize power immediately, but that's going to be really hard when the government is backed by the American military and the Afghan people largely support the military occupation. But if you're in it for the long haul, you might decide that a good strategy is to instill doubt about the new government's legitimacy. Is this a real government with actual power, or is it just an illusion created by the Americans? How do you get people asking these questions? Remember in Batman Begins when Bruce Wayne confronts Falcone?
Look around you. You'll see 2 consummate, a couple off-duty cops, and a judge. Now, I wouldn't have a second's hesitation in blowing your head off right here and right now in front of them. That's the power of fear.
Falcone is using fear and violence to demonstrate who has power. This leads to Bruce Wayne doubting the legitimacy of the government and becoming a vigilante.
I'm going to show the people of Gotham their city doesn't belong to the criminals and the corrupt.
Falcone's technique is used by gangs all over the world, and it was used by the Taliban. By committing random acts of violence, the Taliban show that the government doesn't have a monopoly on violence. They can't be stopped. But the violence isn't entirely random. Like everyone, the Taliban have limited resources, so they need to attack strategically so they can get the most buck for their bang. That's where this graph comes in. This is the number of daily direct fire attacks in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2015. Direct fire means attacks that involved gunfire or grenade launchers. This economic problem explains the spikes on this graph. As part of their strategy to delegitimize the government, the Taliban strategically attacked on election days. But they had to be careful, otherwise their strategy would backfire because of game theory. Game theory is how we describe strategic interactions between actors. It's different than standard economic theory. In standard economic theory, I make my choices based off of my preferences and my trade-offs, or my benefits and my costs. When deciding what I want to eat, I might say, hey, that burger looks nice, but I'm still hungry, so maybe I'll have some onion rings. And those onion rings don't cost that much, so it seems like the benefit exceeds the cost. In that process, I never have to think about anyone else. But game theory tells us that there are some choices that will change if another person is involved. Maybe instead of eating by myself, I'm eating on a date. When I look at those onion rings, I might think that they make my breath smell bad, and that's going to ruin that date. So instead, I grab the fries. Considering how my actions affect another person changes my choice. The Taliban can't act in isolation. They have to consider how their actions affect other people. It's like they're considering onion rings on a date with a very important group of people. The Afghans.
The Afghanistanis.
The Taliban want to delegitimize the government without alienating the Afghans. And a certain way to make those people not like you anymore is to injure or kill their family. In fact, a group of political scientists used intelligence reports from Afghanistan to show that violence that created more civilian casualties led to more Afghans reporting to counterinsurgency operations against the Taliban. And that same research showed that when these operations received more tips in 1 week, the next week they were able to capture more insurgents and clear out more weapons and bombs. If the Taliban aren't careful, their efforts to weaken support for the government might end up strengthening it. So how does this game theory affect the Taliban's actions around elections? First, it affects the candidates they support. Now, I said earlier that the Taliban mostly come from the Pashtun tribe. So you would think in the 2014 presidential election, they would support the candidate that came from the Pashtun tribe, Ashraf Ghani, who, by the way, way, has a PhD in economics. But certain subunits of the Taliban reported supporting the opposition candidate, Abdullah. Why not support the candidate from your own tribe? Because you want to undermine support for the government among the Pashtun. Game theory is leading to this counterintuitive strategy, and you're gonna see it come up again in just a second. Because now I want to talk about how game theory affects the use of violence. If you want to decrease perceived legitimacy of the government, you want to make sure that not everybody votes. The Taliban decided to do this by scaring voters. Some of those same political scientists did more research on violence surrounding election day. In the days leading up to the 2014 presidential election, the Taliban were more likely to place explosives on roads that connected villages to polling centers. Imagine you're living in one of those villages and you're getting ready to vote, but you hear about these attacks that are happening more frequently on that road. You might say it's safer to just stay home. Similarly, in the days leading up to the election, roads were more likely to be attacked if they connected polling centers to villages with high Pashtun populations. Again, the Taliban are trying to weaken support among the group that is most likely to swing over to its side. But this is all leading up to the election. What happens on the day of the election? We already know from the graph that violence spikes on the day of an election, but the pattern of violence also changes. On a normal day, violence is about equally likely to happen any hour that people are awake. But on election days, that extra violence is especially concentrated between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. This timing hints at their strategy: weaken support for the government without hurting civilians. By concentrating violence in the morning before the polls are open, you can deter people from voting without actually creating civilian casualties. In fact, if we look at civilian casualties on election days, they aren't that much different than on normal days. That means there's significantly more violence without significantly increasing casualties. The marginal effect of that extra violence goes towards intimidation. Does the intimidation work? It does. Areas that had more attacks had lower levels of voter participation. It wasn't enough to swing the results of the 2014 election, but it probably contributed to people's perception that the government was not strong enough to protect its people. We like to create caricatures of our enemies, pretending they aren't smart enough to take seriously. But elections in Afghanistan demonstrate that the Taliban had a solid understanding of game theory. Maybe that's why the government fell so quickly in 2021. Since you like economics and politics, you should check out this video on the assassination of Haiti's president.